Good evening, everyone. My name is Harry Smith, and I am the Education Manager at the Zeckman Holocaust Center. It is my privilege to welcome you to tonight's program, The Prosecutor, One Man's Battle to Bring Nazis to Justice. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our program sponsors, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, as well as the PNC Foundation. A special thank you also goes to our community partner, the Laurie E. Tulsky Center for Human Rights of Women and Children at Michigan State University, for their support as well. Tonight, we explore the extraordinary life of Fritz Bauer, a young Jewish lawyer whose relentless pursuit of justice brought Nazi war criminals to account. His courage in confronting these atrocities came at a significant personal cost, yet his unwavering commitment to truth and accountability reshaped history. Leading our discussion is Jack Fairweather, whose meticulous research brings Bauer's story to life. Jack's new book, The Prosecutor, was released just yesterday, and we are thrilled to have him with us tonight. A link to order the book has been shared in the chat. Jack is also the author of The Volunteer, winner of the Costa Book Award and a United Kingdom bestseller. He has served as a correspondent for the Washington Post and the Daily Telegraph, where he was bureau chief for Baghdad and the Persian Gulf. If you have any questions during the program, please type them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. It is my honor to welcome Jack Fairweather.
Thanks so much, Harry. And a real privilege to be with you all. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to share my screen. Wonderful. So when I set out to write this book, I thought I would be writing the history of how Germany and the world reckoned with the Holocaust. I didn't realize that in describing how one man used the courts to steer post-war Germany away from its fascist past, I would be writing a primer for our own time. I'd like to ask you to imagine a history of the 20th century in which the Holocaust is only a footnote to the Second World War, where the encyclopedia entry for Auschwitz describes the flourishing chemical industry in the nearby town, but omits the gas chambers, where school textbooks describe Hitler as, quote, gifted in a variety of ways, and conclude that, quote, no more than a few hundred people knew about the mass murder. This isn't an abstract thought experiment, but West Germany in the years following Hitler's defeat, when the Holocaust was all but forgotten, and the Allies sanctioned the return of millions of former Nazis to forge a new country to serve as a bulwark against communism. It was a time, in the words of the West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, to, quote, let bygones be bygones. And this is the world to which Fritz Bauer, the subject of my new book, The Prosecutor, returned in 1949. I'd like you to picture a scene. Spring 1949. Bauer is on a train entering Germany at the Danish border. He's 45 years old, a small man in a neatly tailored suit with a careworn look. He'd once been the youngest judge in Germany and a rising progressive voice in the Weimar Republic. He was also gay, Jewish, and a committed socialist, and extraordinarily lucky to have survived the Nazis. Looking at his fellow passengers, Bauer wonders who among them had joined the cheering crowds that greeted Hitler's motorcade. Who had killed or watched others kill? For Bauer, these are pressing questions, not simply because of the danger he faces returning to a war-torn country where many might still wish him ill. They're questions he has to ask because he is seeking justice. He is returning to Germany to become Attorney General in the small city of Braunschweig. It's a provincial backwater, and he'll only have a small team of prosecutors. But he's watched the Allies impose their vision of justice on Germany, and he knows it's not gone far enough. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, declared in 1945 that only Hitler and his inner circle could be considered responsible for the Nazis' crimes. 22 men were convicted the following year, and a few thousand more in follow-up trials and through denazification proceedings. The Allies believe justice has been served, and their attention is shifting to the Cold War. Bauer is staggered by the number of perpetrators who've walked free. 8.5 million Germans had joined the Nazi Party. 250,000 had served in the SS that had operated death camps like Auschwitz. Hundreds of thousands had participated in the vast bureaucratic machinery of industrialized murder. And yet most of these people have simply slipped back into German society and resumed their lives as if nothing has happened. Bauer has a radical idea. He plans on using the justice system to force a national reckoning. By prosecuting Nazis in the courts, he hopes to hold their crimes up to scrutiny and in the process expose the roots of Nazism in German culture and, if possible, expunge them. What were the chances of Bauer ever achieving that? Well, one of Konrad Adenauer's first acts upon becoming Chancellor in 1949 is to appoint as his chief of staff Hans Globke, who, as a bureaucrat in the Interior Ministry of the Third Reich, had been one of the main implementers of the Nuremberg race laws that stripped Jews of their rights and prepared the framework for their deportation and mass murder. Globke is now one of the most powerful men in West Germany. Globke's expressed purpose is to reintegrate former Nazis into society and draw a veil of silence over the past. He has at his disposal a spy network of former military officers and ex-SS men set up by the CIA to battle the Soviet Union, but which Globke is using to crush dissent, to keep his crimes and those of others out of the courts. Even if Bauer succeeds in bringing cases to court, will his fellow Germans be prepared to listen to him of all people, a Jew, a camp survivor, and should it ever emerge, a gay man? Any one of those identities might incite his countrymen to ostracize him or vilify him or worse. Somehow, Bauer was going to have to hide his own past while preparing a hostile court system stacked with Nazi-era judges to expose the past of others and convince an exhausted, skeptical country to listen. We often take for granted Germany's role as a bastion of Europe's liberal order and a country that has fully confronted its past to ensure the Nazis' crimes will never be forgotten. We also take for granted our knowledge of the Holocaust as it's commemorated each year, taught in schools and universities, told and retold in films and books. But to join Bauer on that train in 1949 is to realize that a different future was possible, one in which the genocide of Europe's Jews is not seen as the defining event of the Second World War or of our collective history. For the past 5 years, I've been researching and writing a book about Bauer entitled The Prosecutor. And it's the story of how one extraordinarily brave man sought to bend the arc of history towards justice. It's also the story of how the Holocaust was finally established in our global conscience. I first came across Bauer's story writing my previous book, the best-selling Volunteer, which I'll give a brief plug to. Here it is. It's about this Polish resistance fighter, Witold Pilecki, who you can see there, who infiltrated Auschwitz to report on the horrors of the camp. His story raised the question of why the world looked away from the crimes of the Nazis. Bauer asks us a different question. What made the world confront the Holocaust? How do you change a culture that's in denial about its past? How do you persuade people to recognize their own intolerance and prejudice? So let's join Bauer as his mission began in Braunschweig. 90% of the town center had been destroyed by Allied bombing. Almost half the country is living in temporary accommodation, half of the city rather. No one wants to talk about the past. Over 900 former Nazis have been investigated in Braunschweig since the end of the war, but only a few dozen had ever faced justice. The chief of police in Braunschweig is a former SS officer who deported Jews and Poles to Auschwitz. The first thing Bauer needed to do was simply establish the facts. Little was known about the Holocaust in the first years after the war. It wasn't even called the Holocaust then. The history books had not been written, and intellectuals and journalists in Britain and America were focused on the Cold War, Jewish thinkers on the creation of Israel, and survivors everywhere on rebuilding their lives. What's more, the scenes of some of the worst crimes and much of the evidence were hidden behind the Iron Curtain. Here's a map I'm sure many of you are familiar with of Central Europe, with that line running through the center of it. And you'll notice that, or know that most of the death camps were in Nazi-occupied Poland, and from Bauer's perspective, incredibly hard to get information from communist countries. Bauer needed access to that material. The West German authorities had conveniently placed an embargo on contacts with the Eastern Bloc. Holocaust knowledge was instead used as a weapon of the Cold War. Communist authorities in East Germany launched a propaganda campaign against West German officials with Nazi pass. The West Germans responded by using the CIA-backed spy agency to target anyone who spoke out about Nazi crimes, smearing them in the press as Soviet stooges or having the Americans raid their homes. Bauer knew he had to proceed with great caution as he sought to build a network of like-minded prosecutors and activists on both sides of the Iron Curtain who could get him the documentary evidence he needed. In his early years in Braunschweig, Bauer was limited to prosecuting local Nazi crimes. Here he is at work. He earned rancor and abuse from the locals. Some colleagues openly stated he should have been gassed. But he also found allies in the judiciary and within the Social Democratic Party, the main progressive opposition to Adenauer. In 1956, Bauer was appointed Attorney General of Hesse, the largest and most liberal of German states. The job represented a vast expansion of Bauer's powers and profile. He would be managing almost 200 prosecutors from Frankfurt, the country's financial capital and the center of an economic boom fueled by Reconstruction. What he needed now was a trial capable of breaking through the silence and indifference. A few months into his tenure, he was at his desk perusing a file of war criminals that the Austrian authorities were looking to hand off to Germany. He spotted a name on the list, Adolf Eichmann, the man who had organized the transport of millions of Jews from across Europe to Auschwitz and other death camps. Eichmann had been missing since the end of the war. Bauer immediately saw the potential of a trial to expose the entire operation of the final solution if he could track Eichmann down. There was no telling where in the world he might be hiding. Bauer knew that even if he could find him, should he seek to have Eichmann extradited to West Germany, the former SS man would almost certainly be tipped off by the authorities before he could be arrested. Even if he was brought to court, he might only face a couple of years in prison as an accessory to murder, given the Nazi-era judges manning the judiciary. So I tell the full story of Bauer's extraordinary hunt for Adolf Eichmann in the book. It involves a tip-off from a blind Holocaust survivor that Eichmann was living in Buenos Aires. Bauer recruits the survivor and his 14-year-old daughter to track down the SS man's hiding place. Here you can see the teenage girl, Sylvia, who courageously knocked on the door to Eichmann's house to confirm the identity of the SS man. Sylvia suspected the truth because, incredibly, she had been dating Eichmann's son. Then Bauer enlists Mossad's help to kidnap the former SS man and bring him to justice. And here's another extraordinary image. This is taken from a Mossad man's camera secretly placed in his briefcase when he too approached Eichmann to try and establish his identity. Based on this photograph, Eichmann was arrested and finally brought to Israel. Here he is in his prison cell outside Haifa, awaiting trial. The subsequent trial in Jerusalem in 1961 was every bit as impactful as Bauer had hoped. Survivors who for so long had had their experiences disbelieved or dismissed were finally given a platform to speak. One of those witnesses was a 46-year-old Ukrainian-born Jewish woman named Rivka Yoselevska. Here she is. She was the sole survivor of a massacre outside Pinsk, Belarus in 1941. She took the stand on May the 8th, 1961, a week late, because the tension of the thought of speaking out had led to her having a stroke. In fact, the doctors had told her she shouldn't testify at all, but a real mark of her courage and bravery is that she insisted on taking the stand. And we have some video footage of this moment. There you can see Eichmann in his armored glass box. And you'll also appreciate that how close Yoselevska was as she testified against the SS man. And I'll paraphrase what she says in this video clip, but I'd ask you to look at the emotion playing across her face as she describes how the SS men brought her and her 9-year-old daughter, her family, and several hundred Jews from the local ghetto to a pit in a forest clearing. They were ordered into rows as the shooting began. Yoselevska approached the edge of the pit, the daughter clinging to her side. "Who shall I shoot first?" one of the guards asked. Didn't wait for an answer. He shot the girl and then turned to Yoselevska and shot at the back of her head. The bullet only grazed her skull and she toppled into the pit, which was how she survived. Came to Israel to rebuild her life. It was the raw emotion that you can see playing across her face that finally succeeded in cutting through public indifference and compelling attention. But Bauer didn't want to stop there. He saw the Eichmann trial as an opportunity to take on the former Nazis running the West German state. In particular, Bauer wanted Eichmann to speak from the stand about his work with Konrad Adenauer's right-hand man, Hans Globke. There he is once again, front right. What followed was an extraordinary Cold War battle behind the trial to try and keep Globke's name out of proceedings. Globke enlisted his spy agency to destroy compromising documents, trail Eichmann's lawyers, feed disinformation to journalists attending the trial. Bauer too was placed under surveillance. His phone line was tapped. Indeed, it ran through the night with threatening calls. He received bullets in the mail. Konrad Adenauer himself warned Bauer that he risked being, quote, dragged into the shadows if he continued to investigate Globke. And I'd just like to pause for a moment and consider the situation Bauer found himself in. It wasn't only the oppression of the state that Bauer was struggling with. He saw a society around him that remained deeply intolerant. Camp survivors continued to be treated with suspicion. Bauer couldn't talk in public about being a survivor himself or his Jewishness for fear of being condemned in the press as nothing more than a vengeful Jew. Anti-Semitism was rife. Here's a typical scene of swastikas daubed over a synagogue in Cologne in 1959. And what's more, Bauer couldn't live openly as a gay man. The Allies had stripped out Nazi-era laws from the German statute books, except for one set of laws prosecuting or persecuting gay men. If Bauer had been caught liaising with a man, he would have been stripped of his job and possibly sentenced to 5 years hard labor. Bauer was profoundly alone. The more I discovered of Bauer's solitary life, the more I found myself wondering about what pushed him to set himself against the West German state. It was easy to see where his anger came from and how it drove his quest for justice. But what made him believe that a society that had brutalized him and killed so many were ever capable of reform? And if it wasn't anger that fueled his vision, what was it? I knew that the answer lay in Bauer's past, but to uncover that past, I was going to have to delve into a private life that had been very deliberately kept hidden because of his homosexuality, both by Bauer and by his family and friends. I was delighted, therefore, when my researcher, Sina, in Copenhagen, found an extraordinary cache of letters in the Danish archives. Bauer had fled to Denmark in 1936 after 3 shattering years under the Nazis. The letters in the archive came from friends and family from his hometown of Stuttgart and were clearly part of an exchange with Bauer as he was trying to rebuild his faith in himself and people around him. Some of the letters Sina found were written in code to hide identities, although they hardly needed to be because of the state of the handwriting and the fact that half were written in archaic German script known as Sutelin. As you can see here, turned out even my great German researcher, Ingrid, couldn't read this script, but then she had a very bright idea. She said, maybe my 89-year-old mother, Hedy, could. So we sent her photocopies of the letters, and here is Hedy, picture taken from a few weeks ago. She was able to decipher those letters, and so a very poignant moment, I think, because Hedy had been a child, grown up under Nazism, and here she was translating the inner thoughts of this great Jewish hero. One letter in particular stood out. It was to Bauer from his closest friend in Stuttgart, Helmut Mielke. It's chatty and intimate, saying how much the writer missed Bauer's soft and beautiful eyes. And it mentions he'd heard from Bauer's mum that a young man was staying with Bauer every night, and Helmut said he was very jealous. The letter pointed to an extraordinary moment for Bauer. He had left Nazi Germany and found himself in one of the most liberal countries in Europe, where homosexuality among adults over the age of 18 had been legalized a few years before. First time in his life, Bauer could actually live openly as a gay man. Denmark wasn't entirely liberal. The Danish police in particular made life difficult for Jewish refugees like Bauer, who had fled the Nazis. They kept a close watch on Bauer, looking for an excuse to deport him. The result, unfortunately for Bauer, is a remarkable record of his love life in Copenhagen. Police observed Bauer in connecting with a young man in a popular hookup spot shortly after he arrived in Copenhagen in 1936. Bauer brought that young man back to his apartment, unbeknownst to him, trailed by a Danish police officer. This is that apartment that we got to visit. Bauer lived on that ground floor apartment, and the policeman crouched in the bushes with his notebook out, jotting down everything that he saw. Bauer was subsequently hauled into the police station, and it was common for gay men, even though homosexuality had been legalized, to still claim, as they might have done in years past, that their sexuality was an illness or a moment of temporary insanity or drunkenness. Bauer did the exact opposite. He knew the law, and in a remarkable act of defiance, he told the police, I am homosexual, knowing there was nothing they could do about it. The more I looked into Bauer's Danish life, the more I found him finding community that for the first time accepted him for who he was. Among the police files was a list of some of the men Bauer lived with. One was called Paul Wagner, and Sina helped me track down Paul's daughter, Hella. And I had one of those moments that every biographer dreams of as I sat chatting to Hella, and she said, oh, you know what? I think I've got a box of old letters up in the attic somewhere. Let me get them down for you. And it was a big box of letters written by Bauer to Paul. And here's one of them, which had not been read since the day Paul received them. The relationship described in these pages was intimate, playful, vulnerable. It was a relationship that nurtured Bauer's sense of who he was and what the world could be like, stripped of bigotry and hatred. It's also a relationship that saved Bauer's life. In 1940, the Nazis invaded Denmark, and Bauer found himself on the run again. It was Wagner who shielded Bauer and his family when the Nazis ordered the roundup of all Jews in Denmark in 1943. Wagner helped bring Bauer and his family to the small Danish port of Røvig to seek passage to neutral Sweden. Here's a moment from the research that I really loved. I'm sitting with a local historian to the left, Bo Braystrup, Hella, and some of the granddaughters of Bauer's rescuers in Røvig, who sheltered him in the broom cupboard of their room, who helped us piece together Bauer's escape one evening in October 1943 through the forest near their house to this beach. And then in a small moment of historical reenactment, Sino and I and a Danish fisherman in a old fishing boat took part in some of that, the routes that Bauer's family took to Sweden. And one other small moment from the research I'd like to share. I had the privilege of bringing Bauer's closest living relative, Marit, his great niece, to Røvig to meet the son of the sea captain who had rescued her own father and Bauer and his parents and brought them to Sweden. It was in Sweden that Bauer began to put together his experiences of persecution under the Nazis, along with that sense of community he'd found in Denmark. In January 1944, he attended a lecture in Stockholm, in which he learned about the full horror of the Holocaust for the first time. He was profoundly shaken. The very next day, he began work on a book that would become his call to action. Germany must have a national reckoning, Bauer wrote. Germans needed to lead that process and look beyond the crimes themselves to the culture that had aided and abetted Nazism. It was only by breaking down those old values of authoritarianism and conservatism, Bauer believed, that Nazism could be expunged and that maybe his homeland would become a place that could accept him for who he was. That's the vision that Bauer carried with him onto the train in 1949 as he headed back to Germany to confront his fellow citizens with what they had done. That's the vision that made Bauer create a platform for survivors to speak of their experiences in Jerusalem. And that's what inspired him to confront Germany and the world with the horrors of Auschwitz in 1963. It's extraordinary for us to imagine, I think, given the place that Auschwitz plays in our collective consciousness, to imagine a time when the camp hardly featured in the public debate. But that was the case in 1963, when Bauer began to conceive of a trial that would put the camp itself at the center of proceedings. The Eichmann trial had been important for raising public awareness about the Holocaust, but in focusing on Eichmann, it allowed Germans to hide behind the denial that the killing was only the work of a few. Bauer's idea was to indict the ordinary Germans who had operated the camp, the guards, the orderlies, a doctor, a pharmacist, the camp dentists. He wanted his countrymen, the world, to see how their crimes fit together to make industrial mass murder possible. No defendant had acted but alone, he believed. They needed a camp, a community, a culture to support them. In December 1963, the Auschwitz trial, as 22 men who had worked in the camp began in Frankfurt. Bauer had chosen these men because of their very ordinariness, because he wanted Germans to recognize themselves in the dock. You see the defendant there lit by the light in the shades. That's Victor Capacious. He ran a small pharmacy in Göppingen outside Stuttgart. After the war, he was prosperous and well-to-do, a respected member of the community. He was also the pharmacist in Auschwitz who supplied gas to the gas chambers and had allegedly enriched himself on gold taken from the camp's Jewish victims, which allowed him to buy that pharmacy that had set him up post-war. Over the next 18 months, over 300 witnesses from a dozen countries took the stand in Frankfurt in what was the greatest criminal trial in German history. The public gallery was packed with reporters and visiting school groups. And what was to be a sensational moment of Cold War drama, Bauer's team pressured the West German government into allowing the court to visit Auschwitz itself, along with a delegation of reporters. It was the first time the Western media had been allowed to report en masse from the camp, which was behind the Iron Curtain. Here they are stepping through those gates. That's the delegation of the court, and behind them was a large pack of dozens and dozens of reporters who were taking in the sights of the camp for the first time, visiting a place called the Death Wall in the main camp, where tens of thousands of prisoners were shot, and then heading over to Birkenau, where the main gas chambers were. And this is some really extraordinary footage of the court and the team of reporters and photographers coming to the actual ruins of the gas chambers. And it's worth thinking for a moment that these sort of images, which were broadcast in Britain, America, across the West, in Germany, in Poland, these are some of the very first images that most people would have seen of what Auschwitz looked like. Auschwitz is no longer far away, somewhere in Poland, noted the journalist Bernd Naumann, who was part of the delegation. It has come close to us. So I describe the remarkable impact of the trial in inspiring a new generation of Germans in the 1960s to confront the crimes of their parents and lead a social revolution. Bauer lived to glimpse some of the world he was fighting for. Adenauer and Globke left office in 1963. In the years that followed, students and young people began to find their voice, staging protests, calling for equal rights for women, access to birth control, legalization of homosexuality, which a bill was put before the Bundestag in 1968. The Holocaust, as it finally started to be called, found its way into school curriculums and was commemorated in national monuments. Bauer died alone in his apartment in July 1968. He was just 65 years old. He died from a heart attack, probably as a result of years of overwork and stress, and the doubt he always had that he wouldn't succeed, that the revolution he had helped spark wouldn't last, or the reckoning wouldn't go far enough. I think you can see here in that last photograph of him some of the toll of that battle. Only 65, but of course he looks so much older, doesn't he? I think some of Bauer's fears have proven well grounded. We see that in the recent German election results, in which 1 in 5 Germans voted for the far-right AfD, which is openly critical of what it calls the, quote, guilt cult surrounding the Holocaust. I found it in my research too. I was struck by how many families of perpetrators continue to insist that Nazism was the crime of a few. I tracked down the family of Hans Globke. You remember from the start of this talk. Here are his kids. They recognized the horrors of the Holocaust, but told me that they thought their father had actually helped Jews through his promulgation of the Nuremberg race laws. I also met the family of Victor Capesius, the pharmacist of Auschwitz. Met his grandson, who recognized that the camp was terrible, but insisted his grandfather had only been following orders. The grandson still operates Capesius's pharmacy. And there's me and my researcher, Florine, visiting it. Very disturbing. This is why Bauer's story is so important for us today, because he reminds us that we cannot take our knowledge of the Holocaust for granted. Each generation must struggle with the Nazis' crimes, Bauer believed, because the strength of democracy and the guarantee that Nazism will never return lies not in the lines society draws, which can be breached, nor in institutions, which can be corrupted. Rather, it lies in our commitment to confront the past and struggle with its meaning. In a time when Holocaust denial is on the rise, minorities are under attack by those in power. That's never been more important. Bauer dedicated his life to fighting for justice and our shared sense of humanity. If you read the book, I know you will be inspired like I have been. Please help me in sharing Bauer's remarkable story and join me in following in his footsteps. Thank you very much.
Jack, thank you so much for giving such fascinating insight into Fritz Bauer. Fritz was truly an amazing person. I have some questions I'd like to dive into with you. If anyone has questions, please write them in the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screens, and we will get to them shortly. But first, I'd like to start by asking you, what inspired your personal commitment to telling Fritz's story?
I think it began really through my previous book about Witold Pilecki, this Polish war hero who went to Auschwitz and documented the crimes of so many perpetrators. And in looking at what happened to those perpetrators for the list of characters at the back of the book, I was disturbed to discover that the vast majority just carried on with their lives at the end of the war, like Victor Capesius, living the same lives that they had known under the Nazis, untroubled by justice, until 1963, when they found themselves in a Frankfurt courtroom. And the common denominator was, of course, Fritz Bauer. So I thought, who is this? Who is this guy? And then discovered this rich and complex and incredible life that he had led. And that thought of him on that train going back to Germany to confront the crimes of his fellow Germans is just a really striking moment of courage that I knew I wanted to follow him on that journey.
Courageous and striking indeed. I want to follow that up by asking you, how did you feel about the opportunity to explore Fritz's personal letters and documents?
Well, I mean, I think as a biographer, you want readers to really appreciate the man behind the heroic acts and some of the personal toll that his work left on him. And that's why it was felt really important to document his personal struggle, his loneliness, the moments when he did find connection with those around him. And, in the courtroom, he could be fiery and provocative, and he was not afraid to stare down those Nazis in the courtroom. But in his private life, he was, compassionate, sensitive, really looking for love. And, I think that combination together is, it's complex, it's rich, and I think it's, helps bring his life to to connect with us today.
Absolutely. Now, in my experience reading your book, accountability was a central theme that I experienced. Why do you consider accountability to be such an important responsibility?
Well, I mean, he was operating. He returned to Germany in this time when the facts about the Holocaust were not known. It wasn't taught in schools. It was something that people avoided. And so for him, it was absolutely essential to establish the basic facts, and that as a form of accountability, right? And he saw the court room. He's seen in Nuremberg the power of these documents that had been brought to the trial, and he wanted that to be done specifically for the Holocaust, not just for the broader war. And that was an important piece of accountability. But I think what was striking about Bauer, and where I think his story really resonates with us today, is not simply in that pursuit of justice, that evidence he marshaled, those Nazi war criminals he brought to justice. It's that it came with this bigger vision that he saw the prosecution of Nazi war criminals as an opportunity to really show Germans, or force Germans to look at themselves and ask, how were you complicit during the Nazi regime? What is it in your own lives that led to Hitler's rise to power? and to have them really examine those bits of the culture that he had experienced growing up in the Weimar Republic and under Hitler. These elements of conservatism and authoritarianism that he felt, could not exist in a democratic state. And, that ability to recognize those cultural strands made him deeply unpopular. And, I think it's a provocative way to think about the situation we find ourselves in today, examining our culture and why, and not just American culture, but obviously Germany itself has itself begun shifting towards to the right, and authoritarianism everywhere is on the rise. And what is it in our cultures that is giving rise to that? Those are the sort of questions Bauer asks of us. And it's pretty amazing to see him, move through German society at a time when no one was asking these questions, when people would shout abuse at him in the street. And he stuck to his guns. He stuck to that vision that he had for Germany and the world, really, for how to reckon with great evil.
Thank you. That since it is an incredible story. We have some questions from our audience, and the first one coming from someone named Nick is he's asking about what your opinion is on the state of the trials against Nazis in post-war West Germany, specifically referring to the Nuremberg trial, which he did not believe to be a real honest attempt at denazification of the country. And Nick wants you to share more about what your opinion is on the state of the justice performed in post-war West Germany.
Well, I think Bauer welcomed the Nuremberg trial. I mean, but he hoped it would be just the beginning of a much broader process of reassessment and reconciliation through the courts and beyond. And he was really dismayed that by the time he returned to West Germany in 1949, the attempts to have the German justice system deal with its own were petering out. The Allies had attempted denazification process, but they had actually handed that over to Germans themselves to do. And by the time, and these were meant to sort of help weed out Nazis from returning to their old jobs. So the die-hard Nazis had a sort of stratification to rule out the worst offenders returning to work. And in fact, this whole process, by the time Bauer returned, was known as Persilschein, as in Persil, the washing powder, because Germans would go before these courts run by their fellow Germans, and they might be the worst perpetrators you can imagine, but they were given certificates saying they're all right, give them back their old jobs. And it became a whole sort of laundering system for facilitating the return of former Nazis to work. And, Bauer, was just, overwhelmed in some ways by this giant shift that he was witnessing of courts closing up shop, cases getting dropped, the few that did make it to court getting very small and minor sentences. And, by the time, by the early 50s, I think in 1955, just 27 cases were brought against Nazi war criminals across the whole of West Germany. By the time Bauer began his prosecution of Auschwitz offenders, 7,000 S-men had operated the camp. Only 7 had ever been brought to justice before he brought attention to the crimes of the camp. So just that sort of scale of forgetting and silence was really overwhelming.
Yeah, it's incredible to think the environment that he was working in when he brought that trial to court. An attendee has asked, is your book currently or going to be translated into Hebrew for our Hebrew reading audience?
I really hope so. It takes a little bit of a time lag. My last book, The Volunteer, just got translated into Hebrew, so it will probably take a year or two, but yeah, that's the plan.
Well, it's wonderful to hear. Adrian Bukowski has asked, between 1945 and 1963, how was the Holocaust described? If you can go into deeper detail about the way in which West Germany described the Holocaust in their own backyard, or how it was reflected globally.
Well, I mean, important to observe that it wasn't called the Holocaust. That was a phrase that really came in very general use in the 1970s, although it began to sort of crop up in the years following the Auschwitz trial. It was known as the final solution, and the events of things like the Wannsee conference that Eichmann had attended, in which the final solution was laid out. Those had come up in Nuremberg, but the whole Nuremberg trial, did not see the Holocaust as its central event. They, focused on how and why the Nazi leaders had perpetrated war in general, and Jewish victims were just part of the multitude of victims from the point of view of the Allied prosecutors. And it wasn't the case that the Holocaust was completely forgotten. There were survivors writing their memoirs, indeed, famous ones like Primo Levi, who wrote some of the most extraordinary literature about the Holocaust was written in those first years after the war. But it was the experience of Primo Levi. He said in 1955, no one wants to hear about the concentration camps. I might as well shut up. And they were not listened to. There was not that appetite. And indeed, one of the things that Globka and Adenauer did was create a sort of alternative narrative in which cast the Germans themselves as victims of Allied bombing, of Allied justice, and so there was this sense that they too were the victims of Hitler, and that idea planted in Nuremberg that the crimes of the Nazis was the work of a few became the excuse of the nation to avoid talking about those crimes. And when it did come up, Bauer, describes meeting Germans who, once they understood that he was Jewish, would sort of nervously say, "Oh, well, we were all victims of Hitler," and it was not the basis for a productive engagement with the history. And it really took that shocking event of capturing Eichmann, putting him on trial, to finally give the Holocaust its place in a sort of our global conscience. And Bauer then followed up with the Auschwitz trial that brought focus on the camp as that sort of central location for the killing. So I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Absolutely. And many of us are familiar with the Nuremberg trials and the Eichmann trial, and Fritz's story brings up a greater awareness for the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. But if you could speak broadly about the nature of different Nazis of all job classifications, what did the efforts to convict for war crimes look like for really Germany as a whole, and for the Nazis after World War II and after the Holocaust?
So what the Allies were trying to do was re-establish the West German courts. Soviets were trying to do that in East Germany too. There was literally the courts were destroyed in many towns, so they were finding buildings to reestablish basic justice, not necessarily for the crimes of the Nazis, but just literally for how to sort of contain the chaos of the post-war period. And the Brits and the Americans, there's a memo by a British lawyer saying, look, we need judges, and we're going to have to bring back the Nazi ones so we can staff these courts. And they put out a memo saying only you couldn't have more than half of the judiciary stacked with Nazi era judges, but that quickly got ignored. And what you had was judges who had literally enforced Hitler's racial laws, then sitting in judgment over some of the Nazis that were brought through the system. And they often dismissed the cases. They very readily accepted the arguments by, for example, the deputy Gestapo leader in Braunschweig, who arranged the deportation of the city's Jews. He claimed, I was just following orders, and the guy said, okay, sure, off you go. And he walked away scot-free, because that argument, they were just following orders, was, along with the argument that no one knew what was going on, they didn't know where those trains were going, was this fail-safe excuse when brought out in a West German court, and with these Nazi-era judges, who, of course, themselves held on to those that rationale, because they didn't want to accept their own culpability in the system. So it was immensely difficult to bring cases. There's one other tiny little facet that's worth considering. Nuremberg was a moment in which international law expanded to include crimes against humanity that allowed for the prosecution of mass murder for the first time. And the West German judicial system decided not to adopt crimes against humanity. So it meant that Nazi war criminals could only be charged for single acts of murder. And of course, that made it incredibly hard if you had the leader of one of the SS murder squads who had been in charge of a small group of men that had gone through a town and shot, 2,000 people. It was very hard to say, how can we prosecute one single act of that murder? And then it became a sort of murder trials in which you needed a witness to say, yes, I saw him shoot that person on that day and that moment. I mean, and those witnesses, many of course were dead, many were behind the Iron Curtain in the Eastern Bloc, others who had gone to Israel, very hard to track down. And it was really hard to bring prosecutions, which is precisely, of course, why so telling that when Bauer tracks down Eichmann, he doesn't for a moment think, oh, I'll bring him to, extradite him to West Germany, because he realized that, he would either escape or get a minimal sentence, because, Eichmann was one of those desk murderers, as they are known. He wasn't there shooting people, but of course what he was doing was every bit as terrible. And it took Israeli justice to ensure that he got his just desserts.
And because you bring up Bauer's role in Eichmann's trial, his capture and justice, many of our audience are surprised to hear more about the role that Fritz Bauer played in Eichmann's capture and in his trial. What can you say about the understanding that people had in West Germany about Fritz Bauer's role in that capture and that carriage of justice?
Well, that's a great question, and actually shows some of Bauer's great courage. His contacting a foreign government to illegally, as might arrest a German national, was very well have led to him losing his job, because it was that was not how is not how you go about your job if you're a German prosecutor. So he had to do it in secret. I mean, he flew 2 occasions to Israel to try and get Mossad engaged with the case. For those of you who have seen the film about that, the operation to get Eichmann, Bauer does play a very small part in it, but it's mostly looks like Mossad are sort of learn about where Eichmann is, go and get him, and it's a great heroic mission, which for sure it was. But Bauer was very shocked to discover when he first brought them, Eichmann's location, that Mossad weren't interested in the case, pursuing like another Nazi war criminal as they saw it. They, of course, had their own concerns at that early stage in Israel's nationhood of having to fight for survival, and they didn't particularly want to spend resources tracking down an old ex-Nazi, and Bauer had to confront them and threaten them with going public with their inactivity to finally get that operation to take place. So a really seminal role, and just a sign of his courage in reaching out to Mossad in the first place, carrying out this sort of top secret mission with this blind Holocaust survivor and his daughter to track Eichmann down, which also, by the way, makes you realize just how extraordinary were the circumstances Bauer faced himself in. Like, he couldn't ask the German police to contact the Argentinian police force to look up that address. He just knew that would end with Eichmann getting a tip off at once, and had to rely on this sort of extraordinary team to find Eichmann.
It's an almost unbelievable tale. Now, you've spoken at great length about Fritz's intersectional identities, but at the same time, he also did wield a great talent and an influence with his role as a prosecutor. Some of our audience members are concerned with what they see in global politics today, and they want to ask if you have any opinion or if Fritz's words resonate as to how we as individuals can fight against the things that we see or serve to protect democracy and our liberal values that we hold so dear.
Well, I think, Bauer's story could not speak more to our moment, when we see around us this very alarming drift towards authoritarianism, the attack by Trump and against some of the basic institutions of the country. And I think Bauer's story really gives us some ways to think about how to organize, how to stand up for what we believe to be right. What's really striking about Bauer from that moment he's sitting on that train going back to Germany is the vision for what he believes Germany can become. And, I think what's striking to us perhaps is this sort of authoritarian vision that Trump has brought to the government currently, and the fact that it's really asked questions of what the other side's vision is for the country. And, I think articulating that, finding ways to share it, is is so important, because for Bauer, his whole life had been a battle between two competing visions in the Weimar Republic, between the forces of fascism and what he saw as the progressive values enshrined in the Weimar Constitution. He saw it again in post-war West Germany, and it was the strength of his vision that is so awesome. And I think when you read the book, you'll see how these ideas take shape for him. And I hope that will provoke us to think about how what we are experiencing now with Trump can also provoke ideas in ourselves. Bauer, he was alone, as I stressed, certainly in his love life in so many ways. But he was also an extraordinary networker. And, I'm sure there's, Zeckelman Holocaust Center, Harry, Liz, you've done like an amazing job bringing us all here together tonight. I'm sure the people on this call who are also amazing networkers, and you'll recognize in Bauer some of those qualities of just being a source of strength to others, reaching out. Bauer was he was constantly contacting people, hundreds of letters to prosecutors, activists, young students who were beginning to confront the crimes of their fathers, and whom he served as a sort of father figure for, and an inspiration. And so I think you'll see, as Bauer's life shifts from this extreme denialism of the early post-war years, and you start to see the first forerunners of change taking place. Some of these young men who are he's using to go and get archival material from behind the Iron Curtain to bring back for him to use in his prosecutions. You'll see that shift and Bauer's role in it. And I think that's really, really inspiring for us. And I think the third thing, which is maybe, is that Bauer, he recognized that the trials he was staging, yes, they were for justice, but they were also to try and win round to speak to the next generation. He realized that those Nazis that he was confronting in the courtroom, they never said sorry. They never recognized what they had done wrong. He realized this was a long game that he had to play. And and you can see that also in his life, that 1968 explosion that he got to witness the beginning of, spoke to this generational vision that he had. And I think that's also something for us to reflect on, is like, how do we connect to the younger generation, and how do we give them context to understand what is happening in America today, and give them the tools they need to decide for themselves.
Well, thank you so much, Jack. We truly appreciate your time and insights tonight. Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion, and I've thoroughly enjoyed your book myself personally. Everyone in the audience, if you'd like to purchase a copy of Jack's latest book, The Prosecutor, that book order link will be shared in the chat once again. We also invite you to join us for our next program, which is called The Future of the Past, Holocaust Memory in the Digital Age, which is being held here on Wednesday, March 12th at 7 p.m. Dr. Kate Marison will discuss how social media, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies are helping institutions like the HC preserve Holocaust stories for future generations. Thank you all for being here. We are able to offer this program free of charge thanks to the generosity of supporters like many of you. Please consider making a donation to the museum at holocaustcenter.org/support. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.